So in the last few videos, we have modeled a couple of bottles. Of course, I have the hot sauce bottle as well. We've sort of modeled this ground layer, which I wanted to talk a little bit more about that because this is still connected to it. Right? And we've lighted and rendered the scene as well. So we have pretty much everything ready to go now. Now I just need to rig these bottles up and animate it. The last thing I wanted to show you about the floor is that currently it's still hooked to that, and so if I tried to move it around or do anything to it, that deformer is still going to affect it. If I delete history on this, delete by type history, that deformer goes away and now it will permanently stay in that shape. And so that's probably what we would want to do before we go any further on this. The second thing, let me go ahead and freeze this ground plane here, is we also have a bouncing ball in here from a previous part of the exercise, I think. There it goes. So we get this bouncing ball that's animating through, right? And so I want this to be small, or like this is too small for this bottle. This thing would be like the size of a penny or smaller. And so before we start rigging this bottle up for animation, we're going to scale this down. So how I want to do my two videos, or these next two videos, is we're going to set up this bottle to be an animatable object. And then the next video is going to be animating this bottle jumping, basically. So let's start by turning this thing into a rigged object. So, or a rigged model. Currently, these are our two models. I have the lid, I have the bottle, and if I just scaled these together, we would get that, which isn't necessarily what we want. I want to be able to scale this whole unit as a bottle. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab those two pieces and I'm going to hit Control G. And what that's going to do is it's going to put them in a group, right? And that group also has a pivot point. Like the bottles still have their two pivot points, right? The parts do. But the group also has a pivot point down here at the origin. And so I can scale that down and get our bottle wherever we want it to be. I'll do something maybe like this. That feels pretty good. At that point, I can grab those two objects that are inside of that group, middle click drag them outside of it, and now they're both scaled and positioned in the right place, and I can just delete that group. As I create things, though, I'm getting all of this extra information, and as we looked at earlier, there's ways of getting rid of that. Right? Like in my model, I don't have any history anymore, but I got all this scale information, this rotation information, and so to get rid of that, I'm just going to go to Modify Freeze Transformations, and I'm going to go ahead and just delete history just to be safe. And so now these are pretty clean models. These are pretty much ready to animate as they are. Okay, so we already looked at this deformer that we used on the floor, right, where we created a bend on it. I'm just going to create another polygon object out here. Let's do a cylinder. I'm just wanting to show you the results of some of these deformers. Let's move it out here, scale it up, and I'm actually going to do two different versions of this. I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this cylinder, and then I'm going to also create a cylinder with more subdivisions. So these look identical, right? They don't have any. If we look at them rendered, like they're going to look like the same exact cylinder, but this has more divisions than this one does. Now, if I were to put that bend modifier on here, so that's under Deform, Nonlinear Bend. Before I do this, all of these are different modifiers, or different deformers, and they all work in different ways. These nonlinear deformers are ways of getting a deformation across the entire object. Later we'll learn some more stuff about joints and skinning, and that's going to be probably the most common type of deformer, but there's lots of different deformers in here, right? We could do clusters, or this lattice is an interesting one. A lattice puts this box around it, and we can grab these points and move it and deform our object, however we want to. And this is used a lot in modeling. So again, lots of different deformers out there. But the one I'm going to do right now is a nonlinear bend. And again, that's going to put this curve through the middle of it. You can kind of see it right there. Right? And this is also an attribute now of this object as well. So you'll see the bend one there as well. And so if I click on that input, curvature is going to allow me to bend this object. Now, I need to be clear about this. It is not bending any of the edges. Okay, if we go in here and look, each of these edges are completely straight. The only reason this bend is able to happen is because we have so much definition in this model that it can move all of those vertices and make it look like it's curved, right? If I were to put if I were to put a bend modifier on this, or a bend deformer on this, and bend it, where there's only one curve, we're going to get something like this, right? And that's not bending at all, and that's because we can't actually bend an edge, right? An edge always has to be straight. So, so I just wanted to show you that. That's, as you're making your models, you have to remember that if you want something to deform, it needs enough resolution to be able to deform. And we've looked at some of the different things about this. If I move the deformer without moving the object, we get that. But if I move them both together, it'll sort of stay in that shape. So there's a lot of different things that we can do with this deformer. I can also adjust this high bound or low bound. So if I adjust the low bound, it's basically saying anything below this pivot point is not going to be affected. If I adjust the high bound, it's the range above that pivot point that would be affected. Right? So if I just want a little bitty bend in this, then that's what I get. Right? And it's very easy to control that. Let's go ahead and delete this deformer. And let's try some others on here just to see what some others do. So I have, let's try wave. What does wave do? So I can increase the amplitude. So I'm going to go ahead and just rotate this thing 90 degrees here. Right. So the amplitude is going to be how much of a wave, and then the wavelength is going to be how long the wave, and the offset is going to allow us to animate that wave happening through it, right? And so this is still, it has to have that much definition to be able to get that deformation. So anything in this nonlinear, sine is an interesting one. Sine wave is actually a really easy way to get sort of that fish swimming look. And so if you have a fish model and you need it to animate as if it's swimming, this is a very easy way to get that. Right? The one that is probably most commonly used in here, though, is the squash deformer. So if I had a squash and stretch deformer, or just a squash deformer, but if we look at this, it's a circle at the center point, the pivot point, right? We get this circle, and then we get the top bound and the low bound, the high bound and low bound. And so if that squash modifier, if I turn up factor, it's going to squash and stretch my model like that. Now, I want to show you expand is something you want to leave set to 1. If you turn it up too high, it's going to expand it too much. And if you turn it down, it's just going to look like it's shrinking it and growing it. Right? It's not going to look like it's actually squashing and stretching. So I usually leave that set to 1, maybe a little higher if you really want to. But we could also look at the high bound and low bound. If I reduce the low bound to 0, you'll see that my squash and stretch is now just happening on the top half of that model, right? And vice versa. If I, took down the low bound, we can get, we could just get a little bit of squash and stretch right in the middle if we wanted to, right? And we can change the location of that as well, right, by just moving the modifier or moving the deformer. So, if I wanted just a little bit of squash and stretch at the bottom of my model, I could get something like this. Right? And of course, that's not necessarily what we're looking for, but I just wanted to show you some of the ways that these modifiers work. We can actually, let's go back and look at this. We can do more than one modifier on, or more than one deformer on an object. So I could do that squash deformer I just did, right? And I can squash and stretch it. I could also then go and add a bend deformer, right? And so now both of those are attributes to my model, right? So I could bend it, right, and squash it, right? Now, the order in which I add those is significant. As you'll see in my inputs here, right, bend is above squash. And that means squash is happening first and bend is happening second. So when I bend this model, I'm bending the version that has been squashed. Vice versa would have been, or the opposite of that would have been to, if I were bending the model first and then squashing it, it would get a different result. And we can see that by right-clicking on this object and going to our inputs. So we got inputs, and I go to all inputs. Right? So currently the model is both squashed and stretched, and you'll see that the bend is happening first, the squash is happening second. If I middle-click on the word nonlinear bend 1 and drag it, I can drag it underneath the squash, and you'll see now what's actually happening is the squash is, or the bend is happening first, right? And then the squash is affecting that on top of it, right? So it's squash and stretching. So it's going to give us two different results. I'm not necessarily sure which one you want. It depends on what you're trying to make happen. But what we're going to do is we're going to set up a rig for our bottle that'll allow it to bend and squash and stretch. Okay. So let's go ahead and just put both of those. Let's put both of those on there one at a time. So I'm going to select both objects, right? And let's go ahead and start with the bend. Or no, let's go ahead and start with the squash and stretch. So we're going to go deform and nonlinear squash. Okay. And so, like all the VeggieTales or any characters that have no arms or legs, the way they move around is to jump, right? And to actually jump off the ground, you have to sort of squash down and anticipate first. So that's why we would have some squash. But right now, when our character squashes, it squashes toward the middle, right? Or when our object squashes, it squashes toward the middle. And that's not necessarily what I would want, right? Junior Asparagus is going to squash toward the ground to feel like he's sort of squatting down, right? So, as we said, when we're squashing, we're always squashing toward our object's pivot point, our squash and stretch handle's pivot point, right? So if that were down at the ground, our object would be squashing and stretching there, right? So if I did my factor there, you'll see I'm squashing and stretching toward the ground, right? So I'm actually just going to go ahead and zero that out and make sure that my squash and stretch attribute is now on the ground, right? But you'll see that when I'm squashing and stretching, some of that squash and stretch is happening below the pivot point. Some of it's still happening above it. Well, the part happening below is not affecting any model because there's no model in that area, right? So I could actually just take that away. I could just go to low bound, pull that back up to 0, right? And so now when I squash and stretch, you'll see that kind of getting a little bit more of what I wanted there, right? And if I extended out my high bound higher, it will affect more of the model. So I'll probably do like 2.1 or something like that, so make sure that I'm encompassing all the model. And now we're able to get this squash and stretch on our bottle, right? So just kind of playing around with this and seeing what that looks like. Nope, I like the look of this. Okay, so we have this attribute that now allows our character, our bottle, to squash and stretch, and so we can make it jump, right? But let's say that's what we planned on doing. We have our bottle squashed down, and then it jumps or it stretches out so it can jump up in the air, and then I animate my bottle moving, and it does this, right? It's not, like, that's not what I want, right? That's not affecting it for this, or affecting it correctly. So for that to work, this squash and stretch attribute has to go with it, right? And that's 3 different objects I'm trying to animate jumping around my scene, right? So I don't want that. That's a very inconvenient way to animate. So the way rigging works, or the purpose of rigging, is to make it easier for the animator to get the animation that they need out of the object, out of the model, right? So rigging is sort of setting up the controls. It's like setting up the controls for a puppet, right? And so to animate this now, I'd have to animate all 3 of these things to move the character around. And if one of them got off or like out of the way, then it would mess up, right? And I have to go into this squash handle and adjust factor in order to even get some squash and stretch on it. So that's a lot of work, and it just gets very tedious. And so what we're going to do is we're going to create a controller that does all of this for us, right? So I'm going to just create this out of a NURB circle. NURB circles are pretty good starting points, right? So we created this new NURB circle. I'm going to go ahead and scale it up so it's something I can see, right? And this is going to be our bottle control. So bottle, and I always do CTRL to notate that it's a control, not a, just a normal model, or a curve that was used to make a model. And once I've done that, now this is what we're going to pick to animate our bottle. Currently, it's not affecting anything, and it's got some extra information on here that I don't really want. So where I scaled it up, it's saying its scale is 3. I want to be able to, at any point, type in 0 and 1 and have our bottle back to its start pose, right? So that's why we can do modify freeze transformations. That's kind of what that's for. Is so now, let's say I moved my control way over here. I rotated it. I scaled it. Whatever. If I just go in here and type 0 and 1, we will always have it back to the what we would consider the bind pose, or the starting pose for this control. This control is going to control all of the elements of our bottle and its deformation. So I'm going to go ahead and select the 2 pieces of model and this squash handle, and then I'm going to middle click drag those on top of the bottle control. Okay, and so now if I just grab this and move it around, all of that stuff moves. And so the only thing I really have to animate now is that control, right? And it will control my entire bottle. But if I wanted to squash and stretch, I still have to go in here and select the squash handle and adjust that. Right? I still have to do that. Granted, now that I've done that, if I move my control, it'll go with me, but that's just still an extra step to get that squash and stretch. And since it's so easy to do, what we're going to do is we're going to move the ability to control that squash and stretch over to this control, this bottle control. So with the bottle control selected, I'm going to do modify and then add attribute. And what this is going to do is it's going to allow us to make a new channel over here. So currently in my channel box, I have all my translates, rotates, scales, visibility. I want a channel in there called squash. Right? I'm going to choose a float because that's what all of these values are. It can be any positive or negative number. It doesn't have to be a whole number. It can be a decimal. So I'm just going to do squash, make sure it says float, and hit OK. And you'll see now I have this new attribute on there called squash. But Maya isn't smart enough to know what I want that to do. Currently, it's just an empty value. If I change it, nothing in the universe changes other than that squash value. So I need to tell Maya that when I change this squash value, I want it to control this factor that is in here. Okay, so to do that, we have to connect those together. So we're going to open up a new menu. We're going to go to Windows, General Editor, Connection Editor. Now, currently apparently I have a Transform 1 selected. I don't even know what that's from. Oh, that must be from my, okay, that's from my Sky. That's where I've just selected the background by accident. I don't want that. I want the left to be what is going to be driving the change, right? Which in this case is the squash attribute that's on my control, right? So that's the value I want to change and have it change something else. So I'm going to select this and hit reload left. And you'll see down here at the bottom, I have my squash attribute. Now the thing I want to be driven by that, like this is the driver, the thing that I want to be driven by the squash control is, or the squash value, is actually that squash and stretch handle, right? And for some reason I can't see it in here right now. I don't know if it's hidden. Yeah, it's right there. For some reason it wasn't. I'm not seeing that ring around it. So I can always grab it in here. The squash handle, right? But if I hit reload right, that's just going to reload the handle. And what I really want it to load is this input, this squash 2 input. Because you'll see that factor isn't anywhere on here. To load that, I have to hit squash 2 in my channel box. Like I have to select that input. Sorry, let's try this again. Squash 2, right? And then I hit reload right. And so now what I get is factor right there. So all I have to do in the connection editor is I have to say I want A to change B, right? So you'll see that when I did that, factor turned yellow. And whenever any channel in the channel box is a different color, that means something is controlling it. If it turns red, that means it's a keyframe controlling it, controlling that value. Yellow means it's this connection, right? So if I can just close this now, and what you will see is that if I change my squash value, it will change that factor value, which really means I can hide this now. I don't even have to see that squash handle anymore. I can hit Control H, and it still exists in there, but now it's just kind of out of my way, and all I see is my bottle and my control and my squash handle, right? And so now I can make that animate up and down. The cool thing too is now if I hit S on that, it's not only setting a keyframe on the translate, rotates, and scales, it's also setting it on the squash, right? So I can move it and rotate it and squash it and hit S again, and all of those things are animated now, right? Which I don't really want to do any of that, so let me go ahead and delete those keyframes. Because what I actually want to do is add one more deformer on here. So the deformer I'm going to add is a bend deformer. So deform, nonlinear bend. Okay. And so we'll see that with that, I can bend my object from left to right. Now, the thing I don't really want to happen is for the, for lack of a better word, the feet to come off the ground, right? So if I look at that deformer and I do some curvature on there, you'll see that everything below that center point is the low bound. So I can just set that to 0 and it's not going to affect it anymore. Everything above it is the high bound, so I can extend that out to the top or take it down even lower if I just wanted to. But right now it's bending to the side. And so the question is, how do I get it to bend forward? Well, that's entirely just driven by the placement of the bend handle, right? And so if the bend handle's wherever I want to move it, it's going to do something different to that bend, right? Including if I rotate it, just in the rotate Y, I can have it lean forward, right? And so now if I wanted my character to bend forward, I could do it this way, or bend back, right? I could also even drive the up and down location of that bend, right? Now, I want to remind you, though, that that squash and stretch is still on here. And so if I squash that, it's going to squash and stretch it along that bend. Not sure if that's what you want or if you want it to happen the other way. Currently, I think this is what I want. I think that I want it to happen in that order. So I'm going to go ahead and zero this back out, though, because I have a reason to do that. And we'll look at what that is here in a second. So I have my bend deformer. I'll go ahead and zero the curvature back out on that. As it is now, though, if I move my character, that bend isn't going with it, and it's because the bend is not underneath the bottle control. So I'll just drag that, middle click, and drag on top of bottle control. And so now my bend will go with me, right? And if I bend my character, it's over here, we're still going to get that bend to it, right? So that's what I wanted. I'm going to go ahead and create two new attributes on this controller that will control that bend. Okay, so I'm going to go modify, add attribute. Sorry. I'm going to call this one bend. Okay, I'm just going to hit add. So we added that bend. And then I'm going to do one called bend underscore direction. Okay, add. And just for later, I'm going to go ahead and add another one. I'm going to call this bend, call it height, for lack of a better term of it. Okay. And then I can go ahead and close that. Now, what I'm going to, again, none of these are doing anything yet, right? I have to connect them to something. So I'm going to go ahead and select my control and go to Windows, General Editor, Connection Editor. And since I have that control selected, it's going to automatically load it on the left, right? So my bend is being driven by this bend handle, the input 1, right? So it's being driven by that curvature. Right? So when I have that bend 1 selected, I can hit reload right, and you'll see that right there is curvature. So I can do bend and curvature. And so now when I adjust bend, we should be able to get that, right? However, it's bending in the wrong direction, right? So if I want to change the bend direction, what I actually need to control is not on this bend 1 input. It's actually the bend handle, right? The thing I have selected right now. So if I just select the bend handle and hit reload right, it's going to put it in the right column, right? Or correct. And what controls that direction is this rotate Y. So that's letting it twist around. So I'm just going to say bend direction, and then I'm going to find my rotates. Say rotate Y. Okay. And so now if I bent my character, I can change the direction to have it be forward. Now the thing that I noticed the other day when I was doing this in class is the height of this is by default, like if I were to just set this at 0, it would be on the ground, right? But sometimes maybe I just want my character to bend its head forward, right? Or just bend its like spine, right? So, or what the equivalent of that would be. So that's actually just the translate Y moving up and down, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and change my bend height, or hook my bend height to my translate Y. So by default, that's going to be at 0, so it's going to 0 it out. And what you'll see is that now I have this really interesting control that allows me to bend my character, change the direction of that bend, right, and change the height of where that bend is happening. Right? So if I really wanted the head to lean forward, I could do something like that. Right? And then if I wanted it to look around, I could have it do any of this. Right? And at the same time, I can still have my character squash and stretch. Now, it's going to really like do some weird things if you stretch it too much and squash it too much, and just like it would do some weird things if we bend it too much, right? but we have some control of it now. And so now I can zero that out, and I can go ahead and hide my bend handle, Control H, and now I have a fully functional rig for this bottle. Okay. Now, I will tell you, sometimes people have an issue. Like, I have my ground layer frozen, but sometimes I'll try to grab something, and like I try to grab my handle, and I think I got it, but I actually don't. I have the background thing, right? So to make that a little easier to grab, especially if it's going through the floor, you can grab that control and right-click on it, and this is still just a NURBS curve. So I could go here on these control vertices and grab these points and actually raise those up in the air a little bit and make that a little easier to grab the control, right? And if I really, like, I'm having a hard time seeing it, I can also change the color of that control under the attribute editor. So this will be a minute before I can remember exactly. Object display, it's this outline color, I think it is. No. Drawing override, enable overrides, and then I can change the color of that curve so I can see it better, right? So let's go ahead and set it to something like bright blue. There we go. It's a little easier to see that, right? And then when I select it, it still looks like that. All right, so this is going to be a little easier to handle. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the video here, and next video we're going to animate this thing doing a little jump, and we're going to talk about and just basically how to make this feel like it's alive instead of just reacting, or instead of just being affected by the physics around it. So I'll see you in the next video. Bye.